Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Michael Scheuer is a 22-year CIA. I like that. You notice how he smiled. He's a 22-year CIA counterterrorism officer who was involved in managing some of the United States' largest and most important covert action programs in the Islamic world. From 1996 to 1999, he served as the chief of the Osama bin Laden tracking unit in the Counterterrorist Center. He then worked as special advisor to the chief of the bin Laden unit from September 2001 to November 2004, and he was the first chief of the U.S. government's rendition program. In 2004, frustrated with the shortcomings of the 9/11 Commission, Michael Scheuer left his position at the CIA so that he could warn the American people of the dangers we still face from terrorist attacks and how we can correct the mistakes of the past in order to protect ourselves in the future. Many of these warnings and recommendations were anonymously published in his 2004 New York Times bestseller, Imperial Hubris. Here to discuss his most recent book, Marching Toward Hell, American Islam After Iraq, which examines the questions of what went wrong in Iraq and how we fix it. How the U.S. government can salvage the damage already done there. Ladies and gentlemen, and after the show, by the way, Stacy's bookstore has his books for him, for you to buy, for him to sell, and he'll stay here and sign them, I'm sure. But please join me in welcoming Michael Scheuer.
I feel 32 years younger all of a sudden, sir. I want to first thank the World Affairs Council for having me. I'm honored to be here. They were nice enough to have me the first time. I'm a bit surprised after you had a chance to see the New York Times review of my book that the invitation wasn't rescinded. It was such a bad review that my wife sent me out to have a DNA check to make sure that she didn't marry out of her species. One of the points of my book, and I'd like to speak a little bit about it tonight, is our inability as a nation, especially in our political class, to escape, despite all the talking we've done, from thinking about things in Cold War terms and phrasing them in terms of the Cold War as if we were still mired in that conflict. And so the talk, I just simply entitled the talk, America on the Road to Defeat, the lethal cost of Cold War thinking that distorts the Islamists' motivation. Ages ago, when I was in university, I read a book by the fine British historian A.J.A. Morris. The book is entitled The Scaremongers, The Advocacy of War and Rearmament, 1896 to 1914. In it, Professor Morris makes a compelling argument that for more than a decade before 1914, leading British politicians and their media and academic supporters knowingly exaggerated the threat posed to the United Kingdom and Western civilization by the German Kaiser and Germany's growing military and industrial power. The impact of this scaremongering was to create public opinion in Britain that believed Germany intended to occupy Britain and then conquer the world. These claims consistently won votes for politicians who promised to defend Britain against the German threat more effectively than their political opposition. In the last years before the outbreak of the Great War, Professor Morris concluded in words that seem eerily familiar, this scaremongering not only made war more likely, but established itself as a significant weapon in the armory of domestic political tactics. As things deteriorate in Iraq and Afghanistan, politicians in both parties who brought America these disasters, along with their academic and media acolytes, have, like those manipulative British politicians of a century past, become scaremongers, seeking to disguise their failures by describing an ever more monolithic Islamist enemy. They have identified our Islamist foes' goal as the creation by offensive war of a worldwide Islamist caliphate, which will be ruled by the doctrine of Islamofascism. This imagined enemy is most vividly and misleadingly sketched by that devout group of anti-Americans who call themselves neoconservatives. But the view of a growing Islamofascist threat is fast becoming common currency for leaders in both parties. In essence, the proponents of these concepts are trying to breathe new life into the long-dead world that they knew best, World War II and the subsequent Cold War, an era when traditional nation-states championed rival ideologies and militarily confronted each other in a contest between democracy and totalitarianism. Listen for a moment to the neoconservatives' chief, Norman Podhoretz. Quote, "But Bush understood that Islamofascism was the heir of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century, an aggressive totalitarian force that, like Nazism and communism, could be defeated only through a worldwide struggle. And so the question comes back to us, to America alone. Do we have it in us to beat back the implacable challenge of Islamofascism, as the greatest generation of World War II did the Nazis, and its children and grandchildren ultimately managed to do in confronting the Soviet Union and its communist empire?" Close quote. For these fearmongers, the caliphate equates to Hitler's Reich and or the nuclear-armed gangsters who ruled the Kremlin, and Islamofascism is identified with Nazism and or Marxism-Leninism. Listen to the noted Stanford University scholar Victor Davis Hanson. Quote, "Like Hitler, bin Ladenism has an agenda, the end of the liberal West. Its vision is a petro-rich Middle East free of Jews, Christians, and Westerners, free to rekindle spiritual purity under Sharia. Bin Laden's Reich is a vast pan-Arabic, Taliban-like caliphate run out of Mecca by new prophets like himself, metering out oil to a greedy West in order to purchase the weapons of its destruction. There is, after all, an Israel to be nuked, a Europe to be outpeopled and cowered, and an America to be bombed and terrorized into isolation. Some object that the term Islamic fascism is too vague to encompass the differing agendas of diverse groups. But just as racist German Nazis found common ground with Asian supremacists in Japan, so too the shared hatred of the West trumps the internecine rivalries of present-day Islamists. Though for some reason a renowned historian, Professor Davis gives no hint that the today Iraq, tomorrow the world imperial attitude he describes is largely foreign to Islamic culture and history, which displays to this day a marked insularity. For the advocates of this threat, the elegant transferal of a past era's enemies to the contemporary scene is useful sleight of hand. It eliminates the need for hard thinking about the changed nature of today's world, about the structure of and weapons for the armed forces that will bring us victory, and best of all, it lets them blame the war entirely on our Islamist foes. From the Democratic side, listen to Senator Hillary Clinton. "This is a moment of great difficulty for Israel and great peril for Israel, for the U.S. and for free and democratic nations. Israel is confronting a neighborhood that is less secure than ever. At this moment of peril, what is vital is that we stand by our friend and our ally, and we stand by our own values. Israel is a beacon of what's right in a neighborhood overshadowed by the wrongs of radicalism, extremism, despotism, and terrorism." Naturally, Senator Clinton did not have the moral courage to use the adjective Islamic to identify what she believes is wrong in the Middle East, but her anti-Muslim meaning is clear. And on this issue, Senator Obama is in lockstep, claiming that he will take to the White House an unshakable commitment to the security of Israel. From the Republican side, Senator McCain's new ally, Rudy Giuliani, has summed up the dominant Republican worldview. The Islamists want to establish a world in which everyone practices a perverted version of their religion. They want to return to a time before the modern age, to a world in which women have no rights and religious dissent is met with death. These attacks are about a radical form of Islam that views our existence as a grave threat. This is not a debate over values or policies. This is a war over the preservation and expansion of the modern world. close quote. This is a neat and tidy intellectual package, but it is wrong on all counts. It also is one that was used to justify the invasion of Iraq, in which, if used as the underlying presumption for U.S. strategic policy, will eventually lead to America's defeat. Any U.S. strategy based on the need to defeat an Islamo-fascist caliphate, for example, would prepare our forces to face an aggressive, ideologically homogeneous foe that does not exist and is unlikely to ever exist. Let us be clear. The ultimate ideal of Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and their supporters from Morocco to Milwaukee is to recreate the caliphate dismantled by Kemalist Turkey in 1924. But a new caliphate also is an ideal for hundreds of millions of Muslims, liberal and moderate, conservative and extremist. Why is this goal spread so widely across the spectrum of Islamic thought? Because, quite simply, it is divinely ordained. According to the Almighty and His Prophet's teachings, the world's current division into the house of war and the house of Islam will one day be altered to a holy Islamic world. The house of war will end, and Islam will be the world's faith. This is simple stuff, really. Islam 101, if you will. But to accept the doctrine's theological accuracy is not to say it is the Islamists' main motivation. Do bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and others talk, think, and pray about restoring the caliphate? Yes, they do. Bin Laden is emphatic that the blessed land of Afghanistan is the place where the pious caliphate will begin. Al-Zawahiri has said the same regarding Iraq. But such statements do not mean they expect the caliphate to return tomorrow, next year, or next century, or that recreating it is their main motivation. Their yearning for the caliphate derives from a belief that God has willed it as the end state of Islam's earthly experience. The rhetoric of bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and other Islamist leaders is peppered with talk about rebuilding the caliphate, just as that of Christians is filled with references to loving thy neighbor and turning the other cheek and creating peace on earth amongst all peoples. Divine orders are never to be ignored, but only people with no contact with history or reality can expect the arrival of the perfect Islamic or Christian end state in even the most remote future. Thus, the politicians and pundits fostering fear of the caliphate's imminent return are either ignorant of history, ignorant of Islam and its history, or deliberate liars. Perhaps the most lasting impact of 19th century European imperialism in the Muslim world is the strength of nationalism. And nowhere is this clearer than in Islamist movements. Since 1945, a national orientation has dominated these movements. Algerians fought the Algiers regime, Egyptians fought the one in Cairo, and so on. Faced with an Islamist movement whose component groups focus on national goals, men such as the leading jihad theorist Sheikh Abdullah Azzam and his student Osama bin Laden did not reach for a doctrine labeled "Restore the Caliphate" in their uphill effort to unite myriad groups. They grabbed the much more likely to work doctrine labeled "Hatred for the Impact of U.S. Foreign Policies." Azzam, bin Laden, and others were and are smart enough to know that an abstraction like the caliphate would not unite the Islamist movement, as would the tangible impact of U.S. policy. But it was still an uphill slog. In 2001, after 20 years' effort, bin Laden stood only partially successful in making U.S. policy the focus of Islamist groups. It was only the U.S. occupation of Iraq that made bin Laden's argument universally plausible and nearly irresistible. Polls in 2007, for example, showed nearly 80% of Muslims worldwide think U.S. government policies aim to undermine Islam. From this pool, a small fraction supporting jihad would yield abundant manpower. Further eroding the caliphate mongers' credibility is the fact that their argument is an unrelentingly racist analysis of Muslims in Islamic society, one that comforts those who hold the view, but one that underestimates the Islamists' threat. To believe in an Islamo-fascist caliphate is nearing, one must see the world's 1.3 billion Muslims as identically programmed automatons, that they are all willing to obey one set of regulations about how to perceive, think about, and do all things in life, and that they will take orders from one man, the caliph, who would be an Arab and therefore from an ethnic and linguistic minority in the Muslim world. This is not a reasonable expectation and should not cause much worry. Islamic civilization today is as diverse and fragmented as any civilization, and perhaps more so. Islam is composed of scores of different ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages and hundreds of dialects. It is divided into two major and competing sectarian components, Sunni and Shia, and these sects are each riven by theological disputes. Beyond the fractured status of Islamic civilization, the argument of the caliphate mongers is further undone by the fact that an imposing Islamic leader, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, failed to unite the Islamic world by using another abstraction that had superficial reality. In urging Muslims to unite in a jihad against the United States because its society was debauched and degenerate, Khomeini had a sturdy, tangible ploy to play against: the unprocessed sewage that has passed for American popular culture for 40 years. But even with that reality, Khomeini failed to spur an anti-American jihad. Even Hezbollah's attacks on the U.S. Marines in Beirut, while conducted under Khomeini's rhetorical umbrella, were nationalist actions meant to evict foreign forces. Most Muslims today are no more willing to rally around an abstraction and spend their lives to recreate the caliphate than they were to take the Ayatollah's advice and kill themselves to resist America's neo-pagan popular culture. Irrefutably, however, there are increasing numbers of Muslims willing to fight and die to reverse U.S. policies. And it is on this point that those who cry doom about the caliphate threat to America and do America and its defenders the greatest harm. The genius of bin Laden and others lies in their refusal to try to spur jihad by using airy abstractions. These men, though not U.S. leaders, recall the failure of abstractions, anti-secularism, pan-Arabism, and Khomeiniism to prompt jihad. Such abstractions have little power to motivate Muslims to war, let alone provide a glue of unity that can unite diverse ethnic, linguistic, and sectarian groups under one flag. The Islamists' motivation and their ability to incite Muslims, then, flows not from the caliphate ideal, but from the impact of U.S. policy, which bin Laden and others have persuaded Muslims is the main prop supporting Islam's most lethal enemies: Israel and the Arab police states like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Algeria. The impact of U.S. policy is immediate, tangible, and thanks to the internet and satellite television, always visible. Thus, while many in the U.S. governing elite mislead Americans about the caliphate, the Islamist movement quietly gathers strength, motivation, and lethality. A Muslim foe motivated by a desire to recreate the caliphate and who was urging Muslims to die for that goal would be a lethal nuisance and not the national security threat America faces today. The advocates of the caliphate threat usually pair it with what they call the totalitarian philosophy of Islamofascism, the doctrine Islamists would use to dictatorially govern the all-encompassing Muslim world. The concept of Islamofascism is readily identifiable as another attempt by our residual Cold Warriors to define the post-Soviet world in a way that makes sense to themselves. Unfortunately, these individuals still dominate the U.S. governing elite and want to convince Americans they are involved in a war of ideas, identical to the intellectual struggle in which we engaged and defeated the Bolsheviks. There is, however, no war of ideas. There is only a war of diametrically opposed perceptions and harshly conflicting life and death interests. But casting the struggle as a war of ideas allows the aging and blinkered Cold Warriors to limit chances for a long overdue debate on U.S. foreign policy by arguing that changing policy in the face of a totalitarian ideology would be the Munich-like appeasement of Islamic Hitlerites. Again, let us be very clear. Today's world is rife with Islamo-fascists, but that tyrannical breed is on America's side. There are few among the Islamists. It is, in fact, no stretch of the evidence to say that the Islamist movement bin Laden personifies is not just a response to U.S. foreign policy, but a simultaneous revolt against the Western-backed fascist regimes that have ruled most of the Arab world since 1945. The Europe-born philosophy of fascism was imported into the Muslim world in the 1930s and remains the region's dominant form of government for our enemies, such as Syria, and our so-called allies, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. The kind of dictatorship that exists in the Middle East today, Bernard Lewis wrote before he was seduced, bought, or distorted by the neocons, has to no small extent been the result of European influence. This included the only European political model that worked in the Middle East, that of the one-party state, either in the Nazi or communist version, which do not differ greatly from one another. And Lewis's point is validated by reality. As much as we dislike it, there is more participatory politics in Iran's Islamic Republic than in any regional regime we deem an ally. That al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups are authoritarian and anti-secular cannot be doubted. That they would be brutal on gaining power also is a given. But to portray them as communists or Nazis is either a deliberate lie or a debilitating fantasy. Again, Lewis has written, quote, "The study of Islamic history encourages the belief that it may well be possible to develop democratic institutions, not necessarily in our Western tradition, but in one deriving from their own history and culture, and ensuring limited government under law, consultation, openness in a civilized and humane society. Indeed, Lewis has said, the medieval Islamic world offered only limited freedom, but it offered vastly more freedom than its predecessors, its contemporaries, and most of its successors." And anyone who has read bin Laden's ideas about a regime to follow the Al Saud tyranny hears strong echoes of Lewis. Governing in Islam, bin Laden said in 2004, is a contract between the ruler and the people who will be ruled by him. This contract contains rights and obligations for both parties. It also has provisions for cancellation and making it null and void. A final use made by our political class of their caliphate and Islamo-fascism threats is to ensure there is no substantive domestic debate on the U.S.-Israel relationship, a relationship that may grow stronger, weaker, or unravel in coming years, but one that will not stay as it is. By defining bin Laden and his ilk as Muslim Nazis, the U.S. citizen advocates of Israel who dominate our governing elite make sure that those who question the impact or benefit of the current U.S.-Israel tie are publicly slandered as unpatriotic, American haters, anti-Semites, or simply lunatics. No better example of using Islamo-fascist as a tool for hobbling domestic debate can be found than the way these individuals used it to defame Professors Walt and Mersheimer as anti-Semites and to distort their book, The Israel Lobby, which documents the negative impact the lobby has had on U.S. policy in the Muslim world. In this episode, we saw prominent Americans, such as Elliot Cohen, David Gergen, Alan Dershowitz, Max Boot, and tens of others, arrogate to themselves the right to decide who is and who is not a good and patriotic American among their fellow citizens based on the attitude of individuals toward the U.S.-Israel relationship. In this ongoing and ugly scenario, it is easy to see on which side the fascist predilections are to be found. Let me reiterate that those warning of a nearing caliphate and identify it as the Islamist core motivation are wrong. One can never see into others' minds, but the contrary evidence is so ample that the purveyors of these threats are either ill-educated or intent on deceiving Americans. As a basis for understanding our enemy's motivation, which is the first step toward victory, These concepts are as unhelpful as ascribing to our Islamist foes the motivation of hatred for freedom, liberty, and equality of opportunity. Thus, the main source of the Islamists' motivation and growing numbers is found in the clear, limited indictment of U.S. policy that bin Laden has delineated. His list contains just 6 items: the U.S. military and civil presence on the Arabian Peninsula, the U.S. military presence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the Islamic world, unqualified U.S. support for Israel, U.S. support for other powers oppressing Muslims, especially Russia, China, and India, the U.S. ability to exploit Muslim oil at below market prices, and U.S. support for tyrannies, especially in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. No American must accept this indictment as valid, and none should regard it as its citing as damning all U.S. leaders and policymakers. But the same polls showing that Americans are not hated for how they think or live show overwhelming numbers of Muslims hate the U.S. policies bin Laden has specified as attacks on Islam. The Muslim world's near-unanimous view of U.S. policy as an attack on its faith is the Islamists' main motivation and the factor causing their support to grow. And if I may be frank, Americans today face no bigger threat to their national security than the remaining presidential candidates, who, with those now withdrawn, condemned and tried to silence a fellow candidate who spoke the truth. On this issue, party affiliation is irrelevant. When the candidate said the Islamists attacked us on 9/11 because we had been intervening in their world for more than 50 years, he spoke the nonpartisan truth on behalf of all of us. And yet the candidate was dismissed as absurd and faced demands that he recant. On that occasion, free speech was acceptable only if it meshed with our political class's all-party line, which is summed up in the phrase, "The terrorists hate us for who we are and not for what we do." Today, this is the operating assumption of our 3 remaining candidates. The most important aspect of this sorry episode, however, is that it halted the first post-9/11 foreign policy discussion among senior U.S. politicians that would have worried bin Laden and his allies. When one candidate told the Americans the truth and was shunted aside by the others in the media, bin Laden and his allies bin Laden and his allies breathed a sigh of relief. For the time being, their only indispensable ally, the status quo in U.S. foreign policy, was safe. In sum, the bad news and the good news is that Americans are in a box of their own making, one we can choose to exit. We created, emplaced, and are maintaining policies that motivate the Islamists. Only we can decide whether to stand pat or to amend or abandon some or all of them. And in making this choice, we will confront one unchanging fact. The longer the foreign policy status quo remains, the more wars we will fight. There is no doubt, I believe, that America needs room to maneuver in the Islamic world. We do not need Muslims to love us or even especially like us, but we do need them to give us the benefit of the doubt. For U.S. interests, I think the answer is a not yet determined formula of fewer but harder fought wars and policy changes. The first item will restore fear of America's historic willingness to fight with unrelenting fury. The second will cause major U.S. disengagement from the region, thereby slow the growth of anti-Americanism. There is realistically no quick fix, but over time, these 2 elements will better defend America. First, by allowing us to defeat our Islamist enemy at times and in places we choose. And second, by deflecting Islamist aggression back toward its priority and rightful targets, the Arab police states in Israel. Let me suggest a few possibilities about how to proceed. First, start with the truth. We must accept a reality that is unpleasant but obvious. The United States government is regarded as the mortal enemy of Islam and Muslims because of its policies. In doing so, we need neither don sackcloth and ashes nor immediately abandon the policies. And of course, no nation state should change foreign policies to appease an enemy. But at the same time, counterproductive foreign policies must not be maintained because a nation-state fears having policy changes seen as appeasement. We must therefore deal with the world as it is and not as we would like it to be. Our enemies are motivated by what we do, not who we are and what we think. Armed with this vital but rather uncomplicated understanding, we can begin to clearly see the formidable, talented, and pious foe we confront, start to alter counterproductive policies, and begin to draft defensive measures that can better protect America than the 20-year-old policy of bringing them to justice one man at a time. Second, we must change the rules of engagement for the U.S. military that are now based on U.S. politicians' fear of media and international condemnation. We must let the military make America's might felt to the extent required for victory whenever we fight to defend genuine interests. This includes an approach so destructive that local populations will demand peace. This means getting serious in Iraq and Afghanistan, get brutal and effective, or get out. It is a waste of young American lives and fatal to U.S. national security to commit armed forces if we do not intend to win. And if we do not intend to win, we must accept that nation-building programs are non-starters. History and our current nightmares in Afghanistan and Iraq show beyond doubt that durable nation-building cannot be done if the enemy is not first annihilated. Finally, if we are resigned to defeat in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we may well be, the next time America employs its military, it must achieve a quick and clear victory, whatever the cost in our own blood or that of the foe and its supporters. Third, we must stop the endless political and media posturing and debating and close our borders to gauge the extent of the internal threat we face. Until this is done, little of what we do against al-Qaeda and its allies overseas makes America safer. Indeed, the Islamists today are as serious an internal threat as America has faced since the Civil War because of negligent border control policies. Policies based on the unproven value of diversity and multiculturalism rather than on America's essence, a respect and even a reverence for the rule of law. At this point, controlling borders has nothing to do with human rights or civil liberties. It has everything to do with national defense and giving law enforcement a fighting chance to preempt the enemy without having to use extra-constitutional means. Fourth, we must accelerate conversion to alternative energies, expand nuclear power, and fully exploit our fossil fuel resources. When we last celebrated Independence Day, few noted that because of our foreign oil dependence, America has lost much of its independence on the most important foreign policy issue, the decision about when to go to war. If an unexpected disaster occurs in Saudi Arabia's eastern province or in the Niger Delta, Washington has no choice. It will go to war to ensure production is restored. Nothing must deter America from regaining this independence by attaining energy self-sufficiency. Those who demand that we let the market decide, or who demand the absolute protection for Arctic hares or the Gulf of Mexico shrimp-inhabited reefs, even at the cost of dead Marines and soldiers, should be ignored. Beyond oil, America has no genuine national interests in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, save freedom of navigation, which the U.S. Navy can assure. And as we cut our energy dependence there, our lack of interests will become clearer. In particular, energy self-sufficiency will allow America to stop protecting the Gulf's Muslim tyrannies, which now control our economic destiny, export religious hatred for America, and make our advocacy of freedom seem pure and even spectacular hypocrisy. We must also keep focused on the cruel reality that some portion of the prices Americans pay for gasoline is transferred by wealthy Arabs to the Islamists killing their soldier children. Fifth, we must get out and stay out of other people's wars, especially other people's religious wars. Today, America is a major loser in the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the economic strangling of Hamas. America is losing to the Islamists in part because of its absolute backing for Israel on issues that involve no U.S. interests. We must remove ourselves from this savage conflict after offering each side a last chance. We should decide what settlement suits U.S. interests and then call in both sides and say, 50 years of your brutal and selfish behavior is enough. Here's the deal we want. If you reject it, fine. But you are then on your own and can kill each other to your heart's content. In doing so, we must remind Americans that Israel ceased being the underdog when it acquired nuclear weapons and an unaccounted-for arsenal of other WMDs. Sixth, we must stop building Muslim hatred for America by supporting the Russians in the North Caucasus and Beijing in Western China. Moscow will do what it must to win the war in the Caucasus. We contribute nothing with supportive rhetoric and are deeply stained by Russian barbarism. If we cannot criticize, we must remain silent. Regarding China, Beijing is conducting genocide against its Uyghur Muslims by inundating its West with Han Chinese, exactly as it is doing to the people of Tibet. There is no reason for America to earn Muslim hatred by supporting Chinese attacks on Uyghurs, and we are earning such in spades today as we threaten an Olympic boycott over Tibet while staying silent over Beijing's anti-Uyghur campaign. Seventh, we must quickly complete the U.S. program to assist Russia in securing the former Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, funding and personnel for which has been cut by the Bush and Clinton administrations. Full security for the weapons is infinitely more important than haranguing Moscow about democracy. 17 years after the Soviet Union's dissolution, the 22,000 nuclear devices in the arsenal are not secured. Senator Lugar, the co-sponsor of the control program, says it is very far from complete. Because the program is not finished, Al-Qaeda has had a 17-year window to acquire a weapon they have pledged to use in the United States, an attack for which they have religious sanction to kill 10 million Americans. Eighth, finally, and most important, we must abandon the idea of forcing the spread of secular democracy abroad through military, financial, humanitarian, or political intervention. No young American should be called on to die for the insane goal of giving the people of Iraq a possibility of embracing democracy. These words and others like them are spoken repeatedly by President Bush and most Western leaders about Iraq and Afghanistan. No small R Republican government like ours has the right to spend the lives of its young in military crusades for airy and patently unobtainable abstractions like giving liberty, justice, and democracy to foreign peoples. Let me risk sounding nationalistic and even conservative by saying that our foreign policy must revert to what it was before the historical anomaly of the Cold War gave U.S. politicians licenses to be democracy-mongering interventionists. As always, foreign policy is meant to defend who we are, not to define who we are. And foreign policy need do but one thing, and that is to reliably protect America so as to allow the domestic expansion of liberty, freedom, and the equality of conditions. If no additional person on earth ever votes in a democratic election, there is no reason to think any American would be worse off. And is there a better definition of pure and even dastardly waste than sacrificing the lives of our Marines or soldiers so Mrs. Mohammed can hold a seat in the Iraqi or Afghan parliament? The democracy crusades of the last 3 U.S. administrations have impoverished America in treasure, blood, political unity, and what Abraham Lincoln called the rightful influence of our Republican example. We must return to what the founders intended America to be, the well-wisher of freedom and independence for all, but the champion and vindicator only of her own. In closing, let me say that we have only ourselves to blame for today's situation. And we Americans have been here before. During the U.S. Civil War, 1864 summer months saw the military situation stalemated in Virginia and the western states. The Union's fortunes were at low ebb, and the chance of Mr. Lincoln being reelected in the fall's presidential contest was almost nil. At this point, some of Lincoln's advisors argued that perhaps they could devise a peace settlement with the Confederacy that would end the war, maintain the Union, and not incidentally sharpen Lincoln's prospects for a second term. After listening, Lincoln, with an anger rare for him, warned his counselors that he and they must always face the world that is on offer and not the one they would prefer to face. The words of the Confederate president showed, Lincoln said, that he would accept nothing short of the severance of the Union, precisely what we will not and cannot give. Lincoln said that Davis's declarations to this effect are explicit and oft repeated. He does not attempt to deceive us. He affords us no excuse to deceive ourselves. Like Lincoln's advisors, U.S. political leaders today confront and rail against the enemy they would prefer to fight, a religiously fanatic, uneducated, and blindly hating foe intent on destroying our civilization. This enemy does not exist. And to understand that harsh reality, all one needs to do is read the words of bin Laden and his lieutenants. Like the rhetoric of Jefferson Davis, bin Laden's words are explicit and oft repeated. He does not attempt to deceive us. He affords us no excuse to deceive ourselves. And yet 11 years after al-Qaeda declared war, U.S. leaders continue to deceive themselves and their countrymen about the threat we face. And for this, may I add, they have no excuses save intentional ignorance or a moral cowardice that prevents them from facing the world as it is and explaining it to Americans. Sadly, the bottom line vis-a-vis the impact of our distorting our foe's motivation is that we are fighting an enemy we have willfully chosen to misunderstand and to whom we are losing, hands down and on all fronts. Because there is nothing further I could add that would even begin to match the hard-headed common sense of Mr. Lincoln's words, let me close my own prolonged intervention into your evening and sincerely thank you for your attention and more particularly for your hospitality.
It's now time for the questions from the audience, and there's a good array of questions here. One I found that I can't avoid because you certainly are willing to have your say. This is, has anyone ever publicly questioned your patriotism because of your views?
I think it's easier to find people who, yes, they have. Yeah. It's an extraordinary situation, really, because from the left, I'm a warmonger, and from the right, I'm an American hater or an appeaser, an anti-Semite. Take your pick. There's an endless number of names I've been referred to, even more than my wife had.
There's several questions on Islamic fascism. What is your definition of Islamic fascism?
Well, it's not the one that's on sale at the moment. Fascism is clearly not compatible with Islam or Christianity or any major religion. Fascism, I think, is Hitlerite. It's clearly what we see today in Egypt, for example. There's very little civil liberties, a state run by multiple security systems in the military, no recourse to the courts. It simply is not found among our Islamist enemies. It's found among our allies. And that's a very, very difficult thing for Americans to accept, but it just happens to be the case.
Several of the questions talk about how you treat Osama in your presentation tonight. And it sounds as if you're a friend of Osama instead of a foe. Please explain further of your present position, which seems to justify the New York Times criticism.
Well, I think he's an extraordinary man. I think if you look back at our own world, at our own society, there's no man who has changed our history for the worse more in the last 50 years than Osama bin Laden. And that strikes me as a foe we perhaps ought to understand and respect in order to annihilate him. Not unlike, I've always thought a very good analogy is the attitude the Allies took toward Rommel during World War II, or toward Yamamoto on the Japanese side. They were very respectful of the enemy's talents and finally understood him enough to kill him, or to defeat him anyway. Bin Laden is an absolutely unique historical figure in the contemporary world. We have all watched, for example, the Palestinians, all of whom are of the same ethnic derivation. They all speak the same language. They can't get from one side of the street to the other without arguing for 6 months. Bin Laden's organization is multi-ethnic, multilingual. It is absolutely unprecedented in the Muslim world. This is a man who is, though we don't like to admit it, cut very much from the cloth of Islamic history, of Muslim heroes. He is unpretentious. He is not flamboyant. He speaks Arabic that is said to be poetic. He has been wounded in combat 4 times. He has a tremendous cachet in a very poor Muslim world as a man who gave up being heir to a $20 billion fortune, or at least part of it, to drink Afghan water and fight for 25 years. He's someone who needs to be respected before we can defeat him. And I also, frankly, will tell you that he does what he says he's going to do. America has not had, since Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, an enemy who is so intent on having us understand what this war is about, why it's being fought, and how long it will go on. And one of the things I have tried to do in all my books is to draw a correlation between what he has said and what his forces have said and what they've done. And it's a remarkable correlation. It's in the 80% range. If they say they're going to do something, they're going to do it. So laughing at him, ridiculing him, saying that he's running from rock to rock and cave to cave is all good fun, and Americans have always made fun of their enemies. But where has it gotten us so far? We're losing 2 wars at the moment. Take a look at how does he explain his war goals, how to defeat the Americans? Simply 3 simple phrases: bleed the Americans to bankruptcy, spread their forces worldwide to the point of ineffectiveness, and destroy their domestic political unity. That's not a bad description of where we stand at the moment. And if you're going to treat someone who has brought us with our own help to that point with just contempt and ridicule, I think you will underestimate the enemy for the foreseeable future. And let me one other thing on the New York Times. It's a very interesting development because I never really believed in the media bias, the whole media bias thing. I just thought that was where you stood, you saw the bias. But they loved imperial hubris because they thought it was an attack on Bush. And really, in the book, Mr. Bush was only mentioned maybe 5 or 6 times in the Iraq War in about 3 paragraphs out of 300 pages. But this book, if you have a chance to glance through it, is a very strident attack on the last 3 administrations. And apparently the New York Times couldn't quite bring themselves to think that anybody else but Mr. Bush was responsible for the mess we're in at the moment.
Back to Mr. bin Laden. We've read that there were many opportunities to take out bin Laden. What prevented you from doing this?
Mr. Clinton. You know, a half-assed bureaucrat like me was never going to pull the trigger. But when Mr. Clinton was on Fox, he said he took every chance he had to kill Osama bin Laden. That just was a simple lie. He had, by the count of the CIA, 2 chances to capture him and 8 chances to kill him using the U.S. military, air power in particular. And I have to say, people always expect that a former agency person is going to have bad things to say about the agency. I don't. I left because I thought the 9/11 Commission was a disaster, not because I had anything against the agency. But I had, and it was a disaster, and would pay for it for a great many years in the future. But the only disappointing part of a career that was wonderful, and which all of you helped pay for, and I'm deeply, and I don't mean to be flip, I'm deeply appreciative of the chance that I had to serve in our government. The one disappointing aspect is to have found over the course of my career that protecting Americans very seldom comes first for American presidents. They're more concerned about criticism from the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're very paralyzed with fear, even in this administration, about what the Europeans are going to say about them. They're worried about what Muslim opinion is going to do. Then kind of the next category is, well, we have to complete these gas and oil deals, or we have to sell guns to this person or the other person. Then sixth is usually comes re-election considerations, and seventh or thereabouts comes protecting Americans. And I think in the case of Osama bin Laden, I tried to lay out in my book that fear of European criticism, fear of losing a big arms deal in the Middle East, and fear of angering Muslims around the world all contributed to Clinton and his advisors deciding to protect their reputations and their sales rather than to protect us. And the same thing occurred under Mr. Bush. So it is a distressing thing, and one of the things I wanted to write about in the book.
We have a number of questions, and we ought to get to all of them, but we don't have enough time. So I want to move a little bit. I want to talk about Afghanistan, and there's many questions here. So what should be the U.S. policy in Afghanistan? Your book says we have lost that war.
Yes, we have. We have been there 7 years. We have given the American military an extraordinary array of jobs to do with 23,000 troops on the ground. They have to keep Karzai in power. They're supposed to rebuild the economy, build a transportation infrastructure from scratch, defeat the Taliban, eliminate Al-Qaeda, and in their spare time destroy the world's largest heroin industry. They've tried to do Afghanistan on the cheap, and it hasn't worked. There's not enough troops to fix it. There's just no way back from it, General. Now we have all but destroyed our ally in Pakistan by insisting on this return to democracy. We have now gifted, if you will, as the Pakistanis would say, to the Pakistani people as leaders, two of the biggest thieves in the history of Pakistan, which is saying something. And they are now dealing with the tribes to let them go about their business and not chase Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. It's a case of clear historical ignorance on our part. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I initially bought on to the idea that a lot of the politicians were saying that what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq were unintended consequences. And I kind of bought on to that. But as I did the research, I found out you could have unintended consequences that were entirely predictable. And whatever's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan to us has happened as far back in Afghanistan, at least, to Alexander the Great. So it's a disastrous situation. I don't think it's salvageable, sir.
We move to Pakistan. Please describe the ramifications of the governmental changes in Pakistan and whether these changes are better or worse with respect to tracking down bin Laden.
They're much worse. We are almost obsessed with the idea that democracy is the answer to everything. And we also have a very difficult time understanding that our national interests are not the national interests of every other country on earth. And when you look at Musharraf in Washington, where I live, the constant refrain is, "What did you do for me today?" And he helped destroy, if you step back, he helped destroy the government of the Taliban government, which was the perfect government in Afghanistan for Pakistan's interests. He gave us unlimited overflight rights. He allowed us to expand our physical presence, both military and clandestine, in his country. The port of Karachi is now basically a new U.S. naval port. His security and intelligence services helped us to capture every senior al-Qaeda person that's been captured in Pakistan. And for the first time in the history of his country, he sent his conventional army into the border areas where it was defeated and suffered almost 1,400 dead. Now, none of those things were in the interest of Pakistan, and yet we continued to say, what have you done for me today? And as a final reward, we sent Bhutto back to them, you know.
Well, staying in the region there, let's look at Iran. In light of your criticism, would you recommend a change in strategy in our relationships with Iran?
Well, you know, I think there's so many things that aren't transferable from the Cold War to today, but I think the one that is in some cases is the idea of containing nation states. Clearly, Iraq was no threat to anyone. The Iranians, if you look at the map, are surrounded by Sunnis who would rather kill them than us. They're surrounded now by American military bases, and they're running out of hydrocarbons. In the next 15 or 18 years, they're going to be losing their ability to export natural gas and oil. They're in tough shape. If that's not a containable country, I don't know what is. I don't know why we are so afraid of them, or the Iraqis for that matter, but I think that you can contain the Iranian threat. I don't think people realize what a huge negative accomplishment an attack on Iran would be, in that for the first time in 1,000 years we would at least temporarily reunite Sunnis and Shias, which would be quite an achievement.
This is really interesting, but we have a number of questions that deal with the intelligence community itself, and specifically on the program that you founded, the rendition program. Could you explain the rendition program?
Sure. Very simply, in the summer of '95, we had been watching the proliferation of Sunni groups, Sunni terrorist groups, insurgent groups around the world since the end of the Afghan war in '89, including al-Qaeda. The President and his National Security Council asked the agency to begin dismantling some of those cells and people around the world. The goal of the program was to take off the street someone who was either a threat to the United States or was planning an attack on the United States or its allies, and number two, to grab from them at the time of their arrest whatever paper or electronic documents they had on themselves at the moment. Interrogation between '95 and when I was the chief, from '95 until the middle of '99, was not an issue, because the President did not want to handle these people ourselves. They did not want to hold them. Mr. Clinton wanted to give them away to other countries. So the way the program worked was, if you had a yard's worth of senior al-Qaeda people, for example, you could only operate against about 4 inches of the yard, because you had to find people who had outstanding legal processes for them. Wanted for terrorism, wanted for some kind of a crime in another state, usually Egypt, a Middle Eastern state. Then you had to locate them. If they were in a European country, you were done. Europe is a safe haven. They won't extradite or send anyone to a country with the death penalty. Much of the Far East was out of bounds. We had a little bit of luck in East Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus. But you had to find the target. Then someone had to arrest them for you. The agency did not pick anybody up. So they would arrest them. Say country X would arrest them and country Y wanted them. The agency's main role, besides locating them and providing evidence of their threat, was to provide arrangements for transporting them from one to the other. Now, what's always interesting to me is that the rendition program is always dated by the media, and especially by the Europeans, from the election of George Bush. but actually it began in August of 1995 under Mr. Clinton. And to my mind, the present situation probably is more humane than the earlier one, in that no matter what happens to you in American custody, it's probably somewhat less rigorous than what's going to happen in a jail in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. And the other thing I would point out is the agency, we continue to go back to the White House on the rendition program and say, listen, it's working, we've done a lot, but next week or next month, the State Department is going to come out and say the countries we're taking these people to are human rights abusers or have no legal system worth mentioning. And that kind of puckered up the Clintonites, and they said, well, will you ask them if they'll treat these people according to their own laws? And we said, yeah, we're pretty sure the Egyptians will say yes, we'll treat them according to our own laws. I raise that now because Mr. Clinton, Mr. Berger, Richard Clark all say that they demanded that these people be treated according to the U.S. legal standards and international law. It's a complete and utter lie.
We're not going to, we have time for one more question, and this deals with the claim that there has not been another 9/11 because of the intelligence successes. Could you comment, please?
I think there is without doubt tactical successes by both our military and the clandestine service. I think the reason we put so much stock in there not yet being another 9/11 type attack is because the politicians in both parties have been very clever in defining war as only the detonation of explosives. As I said earlier, if you look at this war from the enemy's perspective, America has been under attack every day since 9/11. Our military is stretched to the breaking point, according to Secretary Gates. I don't think you need to look very far to see the state of our economy or our debt. I just read this morning that Iraq is now costing us $13 billion a month. And for someone who grew up during the Vietnam War, I can't remember a time since then where our domestic political politics and unity have been so disruptive and so venomous. So I think the politicians have done a good job about fooling us, but we're engaged in a very serious war that's hurting us on a number of fronts. And I'm afraid we're being hurt much worse than we're hurting the enemy.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California and the Marines Memorial Association, please join me in thanking Michael Scheuer for his thoughts and insights.
Thank you.